Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jack and Shelley. Appreciate it. We took up a few minutes with the introduction, so I'm going to speak faster to make sure that we cover all the material. I just want to say a couple of words of thanks myself, and then we'll get straight to the material. First of all, I want to say thank you so much to the Kehila for expressing so much enthusiasm for these classes. You know, academics, we just need someone to talk to. If no one will listen to us, we feel useless. So it's so wonderful that all of you come out here and help me along with my personal therapy when we talk about history and things like that. I certainly can't do it at home, so at least I can come here and do these things. When we edit this, we'll just remove that little thing about home, I think. Okay. At any rate, special thanks tonight to several people. First of all, I want to thank Joe and Zohara Weiss, who I think were the strongest supporters of this class. Careful with the cord there. They really set the tone for what should happen here, and I think you've noticed a few improvements. First of all, at the end of tonight's lecture, no one will have to turn the chairs around for davening tomorrow. And second of all, we have my lovely daughter Eliza, who's greeting you at the front to give out materials and so on. And we have Mr. Rodriguez, one of our students at Touro College South, who is going to be videotaping it. And in case I didn't make it clear to you earlier, we're going to be putting these lectures entirely on the web as a service to the Jewish people. Just available for free, no charge, just like they are here. And we think this will be something that will enrich the Jewish people in a small way, but I think it's the right thing to do. Also, I want to thank my friend Stephen Mills, a.k.a. Meatloaf, who has been a great supporter of the technical aspects of this project, and he's helped with a lot of the search engine optimization that we've done. One last thing, we do have a donation page that will help offset the costs. The shul has been very generous purchasing the camera and the projector and the screen and things like that so we can make these lectures possible. We'd like to give that money back to the shul, so when you visit the website, which is very hard to remember, it's www.jewishhistorylectures.org, and if you click on .com, it will still work because I bought both domains. Then you'll be taken to a link where you can donate directly to the shul, and it'll be earmarked for the costs of this class and for its expansion. I think that's great. We have two sponsors for this week's lecture. The lectures happen whether we get sponsorships or not, but obviously we'd like to get more of them. Mr. and Mrs. Menachem Sternbaum and Susan Levinton and an anonymous donor have underwritten the costs of this week's lecture. We figured out for this semester it would cost approximately $265 to pay for everything we bought per lecture. So we're asking for $200 to sponsor the lecture. Whatever you want to give, if you want to give, is wonderful, and we're very appreciative. Okay, I think that's it for the general introductions. I think I've met almost all of you, but for those of you who don't know me, so I didn't be without my background is I'm a historian. I received my PhD from the University of Toronto in 1995, and it coincided with my sort of discovery of Judaism together with my wife. And so I mixed my graduate career and my postgraduate career, bouncing around between the Hebrew University and Or Sameach and the Oxford University and the Chai Society and Harvard and a few other really great schools, Cornell. And so I've had really a wonderful experience in some of the top universities of the world, Baruch Hashem, and I've also had the experience of learning Torah full-time. And both these things really come together in my teaching, I think, and I really try to strive for the high rigor of academia that I've experienced in the Ivy League, and at the same time the Warmkeit and the Bren of Torah that I received in yeshiva, and I'm hoping I can communicate some of that to you tonight. The class is going to be essentially a survey of modern Jewish history, like a first-year undergraduate survey. It is pitched to a little bit higher level because so many of the people in this audience are very well educated and are very well read, but it's still generic enough that if you have no idea what the topic is on, you should come away with some useful information. The approach is going to be biographical, just like last semester. Well, I will use people, sometimes famous, as today, sometimes not so famous, to illustrate the general trends of Jewish history and the forces that shape the Jewish world. Since I am primarily specialized in modern Eastern Europe, anytime I step, let's say, anywhere west of Poland and anytime before, let's say, 1648, I'd like you to please not ask any hard questions, because it's not my real area of expertise. But that's basically it. Okay, so are we ready for a quick joke, and then we'll talk about Rabbi Yosef Karo? Okay, so Rabbi Yosef Karo, he's known as the Mechaber in the yeshiva world, the author. The author, meaning he is the ultimate composer of a book for the generations. And that book, of course, is none other than the Shulchan Aruch, the set table, which is the code of Jewish law that has become universally accepted in the Jewish world as the sine qua non statement of Jewish normative behavior. In that context, I'd like to tell you a joke about somewhat antinomian behavior, and it's a joke that involves a fictional rabbi that has no relationship to this shul at all, of course. But the joke goes like this. This rabbi, you know, for years and years, he's been devotedly serving his congregation. But all his life, he's been tortured by the question in his mind of what does pork really taste like? And he has, like, on Yom Kippur in particular, he has this terrible temptation. He just can't get rid of it. He decides he has to exorcise this terrible demon from himself, and he's going to follow the advice of the Gemara, dress in dark clothes, and go to a faraway neighborhood where he will, you know, exercise his will and hopefully not have this demon torture him anymore. He goes way out into, like, Weston or someplace like that, and he finds a Chinese restaurant. He goes into the very back in the dark place, and he's wearing, you know, a baseball cap. I don't know if you've been walking around the beach lately, but at this time of year, there are all these people who come straight from Brooklyn with, you know, the full black kaftans, things like that, but they're wearing a baseball cap. So it's like they're in disguise. Nobody knows. You would never. So, anyways, he's sitting in the back, he's wearing a baseball cap, and he says to the waitress the story. He doesn't say about the rabbi part. He says, you know, I want you to give me your best pork dish. She says, okay, no problem. She walks away. He's sitting there. He's feeling so good about himself. And, of course, in walks the presidium and the board members for a late dinner. Of course, not associated with this shul or anything in this neighborhood, but the presidium walk in, and they see the rabbi in the back of the room. He's trying to hide under his hat. And they walk up to him and they say, Rabbi, what are you doing here? And just as they're talking to him, the waitress comes with the best pork dish on the menu, and of course, you guessed it, it's a suckling pig. You know, a huge pig. Can you, like, move the camera over here when people might tell you, really, thank you. People will think everyone's like, anyway, it's a big suckling pig. And everyone's speechless, and the rabbi finally says, can you believe this restaurant? You order a piece of fresh fruit, and look how they pachki it up. Okay, I think the start of the joke was better than the end. But let's go straight to the material. His dates are 1488 to 1575. Rabbi Yosef Karo, sometimes spelled with a C. It's the same person, obviously. He was born in Spain, possibly in Portugal, and he certainly suffered the deleterious effects of the Spanish and the Portuguese expulsion, which we discussed last semester in great detail. He was most famous as a halachist, but he has tremendous credentials as a Kabbalist as well, and I'm hoping towards the end of this lecture to try to describe how these two factors came together to create the unique personality that's found in the Shulchan Aruch itself. And as I mentioned, his main claim to fame is that he is the author of this code of Jewish law. His early years took him from Spain. His family fled from Spain into Portugal, where they were allowed to remain for several years, and then they were expelled once again. He went to Turkey, and he began a rather peripatetic existence where he went from place to place. His primary teacher was his father, and later his uncle, so it was really very much a family affair the way that he studied Torah. He was married 3 times, And he had 7 known children. 3, unfortunately, predeceased him. Here's an interesting Israeli, this is a Yishuv-era postage stamp. We have no idea if this picture, which is the iconic image of the Mechaber, actually looks like him, but that's sort of like the picture of the Rambam that you see over and over again. It's sort of like everyone's agreed that must be what he looked at. He had quite close associations with many other rabbis of the period, and in fact one of his daughters married the son of the famous Arizal, Rabbi Isaac Luria of Tzfat, and we'll speak about their association in greater detail. He also had some interesting influences from Shlomo Molcho, who is a fascinating character, and perhaps we'll spend more time speaking about him in greater detail in a later class, perhaps 2 semesters from now. Shlomo Molcho was also of Spanish origin. He was a converso who, like Uriel da Costa that we spoke about a few weeks ago, decided to return to Judaism. But whereas Uriel da Costa was never completely comfortable with his conversion and could not find an intellectual space within the Sephardic communities of Amsterdam and elsewhere, Shlomo Molcho kind of like flipped out. He went completely, flipped out is the term that they use for the young people, when they go to seminary and they come back and they don't want to eat your food and things like that. So he really flipped out. He had messianic pretensions. He had difficulty associating with any Jewish community because they thought he was all just too radical. He circumcised himself when he was in his 20s because he couldn't find a mohel who would do it. That's fairly extreme behavior. He had various negative relations with the Jewish community because he insisted that they should radicalize and they should take greater steps towards accelerating the pace of messianic clock. And ultimately, he got into trouble with the state, and he was burned at the stake in 1532. This is actually his highly stylized signature. That gives you a sense of what must be going on in his head if that's how he puts his John Hancock down. Rabbi Karo, however, was really quite impressed with the purity of motivation and intention of Shlomo Molcho, and among the many positive things that he said about him was that after seeing his death, he prayed that he himself would come to a similar end. Rav Karo wished to die a martyr's death like Shlomo Molcho. He did not receive that privilege, and there's not much to say about that. Rabbi Karo's fame really extends from the period of time that he spent in Tzfat, where he moved when he was 48. He had already been working on his magnum opus, which I'm going to discuss in a moment, the Beit Yosef. So he carried with him a certain measure of fame when he came into this very unusual circle of rabbis that were involved in this particular northern Israel city. There were a few factors that brought together some, highly unique rabbis, including the Arizal that I mentioned earlier, his student Rabbi Moshe Cordovero, the Ramak, and Yosef Karo, among others. And Yosef Teitzak, who was also the teacher of Shlomo Molcho, was there at the time. There was, perhaps I should say, one of the most significant elements was the Abramson rule of history at work once again. Thank you so much. Sahara gets it. Money. There was suddenly Jewish money in the region. The Rothschilds had specifically secured a parcel of land in northern Israel that would make it possible for Jews to settle there and to pursue their scholarship. Because, im ein kemach ein Torah, if there is no flour, there is no Torah. Suddenly in Tzfat there was a small, tiny area where Jewish scholars were especially valued and could pursue their studies. And he came into this region with a significant amount of authority based on his previous works, and his authority grew even greater. Yes, please.
The Rothschilds were putting money into Israel in the 1500s?
Yeah, we've got money back then earlier. And if I'm wrong, you'll never know until I put this on the web and I cut this whole discussion out. But I'm pretty sure it was the Rothschilds. Maybe it was Montefiore. It's too early for Montefiore. Yeah, I think it is Rothschilds. Okay. Let's go on to the next question. Okay, now let's talk about the Beit Yosef. This is the book that really, among Sephardim in particular, he's more known for the Beit Yosef than he is for the Shulchan Aruch. And among those who learn halacha deeply, gain a much deeper respect for the Beit Yosef than for the Shulchan Aruch, which is much more popularly known. The Beit Yosef is essentially an encyclopedic commentary on the most current code of the time, the Torah. And in the next few slides, I'll take you through the process of codification and why it was so significant to have a commentary like the Beit Yosef. But basically, one of the things that plagued the commentators in their creation of codes is that it was simply too onerous to explain all of their thought processes. So it's much easier for a codifier to simply say, this is the halacha, please don't bother me anymore. And in later generations, when the author's personal status was no longer quite as well regarded, or if someone wrote a competing code, then no one could really sort out which code was appropriately followed. What the Beit Yosef did was it delved into the reasoning of the Torah, and that's Rabbi Asher, I'll show you him in just a second, and he brought all of the relevant passages from the Talmud to support the decision of the Torah. In other words, he completely explained, he dug in an archaeological fashion, and he discovered what was the reasoning of the Torah for arguing a particular position. He then went on to do the same thing, by the way, for Maimonides in a commentary called the Kesef Mishnah. And by writing this commentary, the Beit Yosef, he demonstrated that he had absolute control over the meaning of the text as written by the Torah. It was the ultimate critical analysis of a halachic code, and it was a phenomenal act of scholarship that undoubtedly provided him with tremendous appropriate regard. It took him 20 years to write it. It took him far less time to write the Shulchan Aruch itself, which is much more well known. And the main purpose was he provided the Talmudic background for the decisions of the Torah. Okay. Any questions about the Beit Yosef yet? Okay, so let's go to the actual process of codification. And I apologize, some of these slides were already presented in the Maimonides lecture. I hope you've totally forgotten them so they won't look too familiar. The Talmud is a very difficult document to work with in terms of practical halacha, practical law. The primary reason is because the information is scattered throughout 20-odd volumes of text, written without a single punctuation mark, and with very, very difficult arcane language that is simply, unless you have years of training, it's very difficult to learn even how to read a single page of the Talmud. And so, and the fact is that the halakhic discussions are not found in an organizational pattern that we would associate with Western thinking, meaning there are no, this chapter is going to deal entirely with marriage. This chapter is going to deal entirely with divorce. Marriage and divorce are scattered throughout the entire Talmud. And you can miss a really important passage unless you have learned the entire book. It's a very, very difficult book to work with that way. And so that's why there was so much emphasis on the person of the Talmid Chacham, the wise student, who was someone who had swum in the depths of the Torah, of the Talmud, and was able to remember that, oh yeah, way over in volume 17, there's a reference to this that I have to access. By the way, as a small parenthetical note, this is dramatically changing in our time because of the power of the personal computer and the internet. The things that used to make a person well regarded as a scholar was a prodigious memory and an ability to recall, oh yes, this happens over in volume 17. But nowadays, sitting at home on my computer, in my pajamas, I can type in a keyword and I can find every single time it's mentioned in the entire corpus of Jewish literature, not only the Talmud. So it's changing the definition of what is scholarship in the Jewish world. At any rate, the material is organized in a way that's very difficult to access, and so it naturally lends itself to codification. If you want to actually apply the Talmud as a way of life, you have to create a code which essentially organizes all of the halachot in an organized fashion so you can study it from beginning to end. The early codes developed from the so-called Monei HaMitzvot, the counters of the mitzvot. There's a passage in the Talmud that refers to the number of mitzvot in the entire Torah as being 613, Taryag mitzvot. It's a well-known idea that so many people had carried around with them, but no one really bothered actually trying to count them until you get to the high Middle Ages, when you have a few rabbis who begin to say, let's count them up. In particular, Moshe ben Yaakov of Kusi, who was a rabbi from France, he wrote a book called Sefer Mitzvot Hagadol, the Big Book of Mitzvot, or Smag, Sefer Mitzvot Hagadol, in which he listed them all, just the commandments, just what we're supposed to do, not how we're supposed to do them. And he listed them in positive and in negative commandments, thou shalt and thou shalt nots. So that was useful, and that spurred a sort of mini industry in codifying, because many people said, wait a second, I never count commandment number 148 as a commandment. That's just a custom. You don't have to worry about that. It's just a custom. And other people said, no, this is a real halacha. This is a law from Torah, from Moshe at Sinai. So there were competing Monei HaMitzvot. They were all arguing for slightly different variations of what were actually in the mitzvot. Furthermore, there's a lot of material that's no longer relevant, or currently not relevant in our day, with the absence of the temple. A tremendous amount of halachot dealing with the maintenance of ritual purity, which we have only in small areas like in washing natilat yadayim or in visiting the mikvah, but is really quite a bit more extensive in the Talmud. And all the laws of the sacrifices, the laws of the structure of the temple, and so on. So what do we do with these laws if we are no longer, or at this point, not having a temple in existence? Still, they're part of the 613. Maimonides created the greatest code of the era in his Mishnah Torah, and I won't take too much time to speak about that because we did speak about it at an entire lecture a little while ago, in which he wrote a completely comprehensive code that covers the temple period, it covers the Messianic period, it covers all kinds of things like laws of opinions, how you should think, not how you should act. And his particular code fell under extremely harsh criticism for several reasons, one of which was he did not have the Kesef Mishnah at the time. He did not provide all of his sources, he did not provide the back and forth of why he decided to take one position versus another. Okay, I've talked a lot. I should pause for a question. Yes, Joe?
Wasn't there a discrepancy between 613 and 614 with Rambam?
Maimonides or Fackenheim?
I remember. One said 614.
I'm not familiar with that. I know that the Ramban took issue with some of them, and he wrote a commentary on his Sefer HaMitzvot. But I'm not familiar. I am familiar with this concept from a modern philosopher that I actually had the privilege to study with when I was at the University of Toronto, Emil Fackenheim, who argued very effectively, I think in a literary way, but not quite as effective theologically, that there exists a 614th commandment. So nowadays there is one more commandment, and that commandment is, quote unquote, not to give Hitler any posthumous victories. In other words, he says there is a commanding voice of Auschwitz that corresponds to the commanding voice of Sinai. So it's not exactly, a frum kind of thought, but we can certainly appreciate, he was a survivor himself, you can appreciate the motivation for that kind of thinking. It's a good question. Any other questions, arguments? Okay, so let's go on then. The Maimonidean controversy, as we discussed a few weeks ago, ended in tremendous tragedy as Maimonides' books were burned by Jews, and then shortly thereafter the French government actually burned the Talmud as well. And his books remain somewhat controversial in some circles even to this day. So now let's turn to the Tur, which is the book upon which Rabbi Yosef Karo made his signal contribution. The Tur is another code that departed from Maimonides' strategy altogether. Maimonides organized all of the laws of the Torah in 14 books, which he called the Yad HaChazaka, the strong hand, Yad meaning Yud and Dalet, 14. And as I mentioned, it covered everything. It covered the laws, before when we had the temple, the laws of the Messiah, and so on, and a lot of things that we simply don't deal with today. So it was quite a massive book to work your way through. The Tur, Rabbi Yaakov ben Asher, in the 14th century, went for a much more modest proposal. He said, let's just get right the things that we do today. And he decided to omit anything that did not deal with behavior. So there's no laws of opinions, no laws of beliefs, there's no laws of the temple, and so on. He named it after the 4 rows of the breastplate of the Kohen Gadol, the Arba'a Turim, the 4 rows. And the 4 distinct sections proved to be the organizational framework that all future codes of Jewish law would adopt. And they are, the first section is Orach Chaim, or the way of life. And this section, which is typically widely studied in yeshivot today, deals primarily with what people do in the normal course of their day and in the holiday cycle. So it begins with how you're supposed to wake up in the morning, how you're supposed to dress yourself in the morning, how long it should take you, Elisa, to get out of bed in the morning. It's right there, first halacha. We're going to have to spend some time talking about that one. So, the teenager, so anyways, getting out of bed in the morning, things like that. Then the laws of prayer, the laws of saying blessings, and there's a whole section on the laws of Shabbat. And basically, Orach Chaim is what the average Jew needs to know to live an observant lifestyle. That one section. It's been commented upon many, many times, including 2 very famous commentaries that are widely in use today. The Mishnah Brura by the Chafetz Chaim is a commentary on Orach Chaim, and the Aruch HaShulchan, not to be confused with the Shulchan Aruch, is also a 19th century commentary on it used today. The second section of the Tur, and by the way, if Orach Chaim is for regular Jews, and learned Jews, but regularly learned Jews, the next level up is called Yoredea. Let's go down to the bottom here. This is like rabbinical level 1. If you want to be a rabbi, in most yeshivot, you must master this section, Yoredea, which deals primarily with ritual law in the areas of keeping kosher and in the laws of sexuality. In other words, it's a little bit more complicated. You have to understand the whole issues of mixtures of milk and meat, and the issue of what makes a cow kosher or not kosher, and so on, and the laws of regular family life. And so typically in yeshivot, Yoredea is studied by rabbinical students, and then they have an examination on it. If they pass that examination, then they receive the smicha with the title Yore Yore, meaning can he teach? Yes, he can teach. Yore Yore. That's assuming that he already knows Orach Chaim. He can't get to Yoredea without knowing Orach Chaim. Then the next 2 levels are reserved for much higher level of smicha. We have Even HaEzer, which deals with marriage and divorce law, and strange laws like levirate marriage, if a man dies childless, and the attachment of his widow to the brother-in-law, all those kinds of things. And finally, Choshen Mishpat, which deals with monetary law. The main reason why monetary law is considered the highest is because with ritual law, if you get a question, is this chicken kosher, you can always sort of back out and say, you better consider it treif, not kosher. And then, you may have caused someone a financial loss in the case of the chicken, but, it's not the worst thing that could happen. If you make a decision in monetary law, however, that's wrong, you'll be taking money out of one person's pocket and putting it into another, so you're an accessory to theft in that regard. So Choshen Mishpat is considered a much more onerous level of smicha, and the title of a person who passes that level is called Yadin Yadin, which means, can he judge? Yes, he can judge. Okay. So this is the way the tour organized all of Jewish law, and you'll notice that it is quite comprehensive, but it's also quite limited to the kind of things that we enjoy in this diaspora existence, not in a messianic future or anything like that. This system of numbering and organization is completely different from the Mishnah Torah, and in fact the Mishnah Torah's numbering system was totally abandoned after the Tur wrote his commentary. The Beis Yosef is the commentary on the Tur explaining why he made all of these decisions the way he did. Okay, I should pause for questions. It's been about 30 minutes since I told a joke, so I think maybe I should think of a joke. Does anyone have a good joke? Joe, do you know? Is it a joke that I can tell people?
Oh, okay.
No joke. Okay, so I'm hoping that one will appear in my head shortly. Actually, did I tell you the joke about the anti-alcohol campaign in the Soviet Union?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay, good. So this is a good joke. I'll tell you this one. I think I did, but I'm glad you forgot it. So here's the joke. It's a joke I actually heard first in Ukrainian when I was studying there. It's much funnier in Ukrainian, but I'll try it in English anyways. That in the late 90s, as the late 80s, when the Soviet Union was collapsing, they had a serious problem with alcoholism. People were drinking a lot of vodka. People were drinking whiskey, horilka, and they were even drinking homemade moonshine, which they called samahon, which means self-cooked. And it was very dangerous. You know, it could be poisonous. You could go blind from it. It was terrible. So Gorbachev, and this is true, he started a massive anti-alcohol campaign, and he tried to promote, you know, more. What's the word for anti-alcoholism? Abstinence. Sobriety, no, that's another word. Temperance. Temperance is the word. He wanted to promote temperance, and he went all over the country, and there were so many jokes about this period. So this joke goes like this. He gets on a plane, and he takes a whole bunch of journalists with him, and he goes to a construction factory in Siberia, and he wants to speak to average Russians. And he brings the journalists with him right there into the factory floor, and there's a conveyor belt, and he picks some Russian worker. He goes up and he says to him, Ivan, tell me, do you think a person can have a drink and then go to work in the morning? And Ivan looks at him and says, well, Mikhail Sergeyevich, yes, I think it's possible. So he says, Ivan, do you think a person could have 3 shots of horilka and go to work in the morning? And he says, Mr. President, yes, I think it's possible. He says to him, Ivan, do you think a person can have 10 shots of samahon and still go to work in the morning? He says, you see, I'm working. So I usually use that joke to tie... questions?
I just wanted to... you mentioned Spot, and when I think of Spot and the Kabbalah, I think of the Baal Shem Tov, and this idea of oral Chaim. I know the Baal Shem Tov wanted to spread Torah throughout, for the general people. Would this be a precursor, meaning the idea of organizing these thoughts in this type of way so that it could be more accessible to everyday Judaism?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's a very profound question. Jumping ahead just for a second, and it's so appropriate they should mention the Baal Shem Tov, because the joke goes, it's a joke, it's a stereotype, but it still has a kernel of truth to it. The Chassid says, why do I need a Sefer? I have a Rebbe. Right? What do I need a book for? I have a rabbi to tell me what to do. And the Misnaged, the Lithuanian Jews, they're known for their superior fashion sense and their good looks. They say, what do I need a Rebbe for? I have a Sefer. What do I need a teacher for? I don't have to ask any human being. I'll just look at a book. I'll decide for myself. And that's like a cultural orientation between the two groups. When the Tur, it's not so much on the Beis Yosef, but when he wrote the Shulchan Aruch, if you think about it for a second, essentially he's disenfranchising an entire rabbinical industry, because the mastery of halacha is no longer dependent, not to the same degree that it was under Maimonides, but still quite so for his era, is no longer dependent on someone who's mastered the entire Talmud. You just have to have someone who has enough Hebrew skills to be able to navigate the section headings of the Shulchan Aruch, and at least theoretically, he can tell you, or she can tell you, what the halacha is. And this is a big shift in the democratization of Judaism that definitely is characteristic of the Baal Shem Tov. So there's a very unique parallel there. I have one more kind of point I don't want to forget, but I'll bring it up when I talk about the Smicha controversy. Yes, please.
We are with the Shulchan Aruch. I like to have a few sentences if you mention the Ganzfried Kitzur Shulchan Aruch.
Sure. Okay.
This is much closer for the general public.
Sure. So
It's a
it's
big,
jumping
big
ahead a little
item.
bit, but again, since you're right, the Torah deals with these four large areas, and the Shulchan Aruch also uses these four large areas. But the vast majority of a person's life does not have to deal with Choshen Mishpat, and hopefully you only have to deal with Evan HaEzer minimally, like getting married once, let's say, and that's it, and hopefully you don't have to return to it too often. But you will always need Orach Chaim and Yoredeah. So, certain amounts of Yoredeah. So a Hungarian rabbi named Ganzfried in the mid-19th century wrote a one-volume version called the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, the short one. Well, it was published in Hebrew in one. Now, if you buy the English translation, it comes in like 7, I think, and for a while there was an English translation in 3. It's not so short, but it's called the Short Shulchan Aruch, and basically it's an abbreviated version of Orach Chaim with a little bit of Yoredeah thrown in. Like, for example, in Yoredeah, the laws of honoring parents, Aliza, are found in Yoredeah. So if you only study Orach Chaim, you're going to totally miss that really crucial section. There we go. Okay.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Yes. Oh, no, hard question. Okay.
So, you're saying that things like Rabbi Ganzfried's book or the Mishnah Berurah are actually directly descended from the Torah and not from the Shulchan Aruch?
Yes. Yes. The text of the Torah is not the same as the text of the Shulchan Aruch, but he totally took over the numbering system, and like a layman's guess would be maybe 30% of his language.
And so which one came first, the Torah or the Shulchan Aruch?
The Torah, absolutely. The Torah was written. Rabbi Yosef Karo wrote the commentary on the Torah. He wrote a commentary on the Rambam, and then he said, "That's it. I'm writing my own halacha." And he wrote the Shulchan Aruch at this point, which is what I'm going to talk about in 1 second. But it is descended from the Torah. And if you really want,
because you would think the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch comes from the Shulchan Aruch, but you're saying the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch does not come.
oh no, it's a straight lineage. The Torah, Beit Yosef, Shulchan Aruch, Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, Mishnah Berurah, Orach Chaim, Orach HaShulchan, they're all in one straight line. Maimonides is in a different room. Everybody else, though, is following in lockstep. Now, the context of this, you should understand, it's a very wild time intellectually for Jews, especially in Tzfat. And one of the developments that's going on is the possibility of the renewal of smicha. Smicha is ordination in English. The term means to lean upon or to rely upon, and it comes from the original smicha when Moshe gave smicha to Yehoshua. Moses gave to Joshua. He put his hands on his head, and he said, "Okay, you're the next leader of the Jewish people after I'm gone." This laying on of hands, to use the Christian term, was practiced for many, many generations, well into the Temple period, and that's how the rabbis were ordained for the Sanhedrin, the grand court of Jerusalem. However, after the exile from Jerusalem in the 1st century, smicha was lost. The chain of transmission of who was authorized to give smicha to a student was completely lost, and so for 1,500 years, smicha had gone to waste. In fact, when we call a person a rabbi today, it does not mean the same thing as it would have meant back in the ancient period. Rabbi today is a title it's an honorific that we apply to people who have accomplished a certain level of learning, but it does not, let's say, to compare it to, let's say, a Christian priest, it does not confer some kind of special magical power. Not all rabbis believe that, but I remember. So I'll tell you, I gotta be careful. Thank you. But I remember once. This is a little bit of a tangent. I hope you don't mind, but we're okay for time. It's a good story, though. It's the famous air conditioner story. A lot of my students. Did I tell you this one, Mr. Lax? The air conditioner story. It's a good story. So this is a true story. I'll tell you quickly. I hope you don't mind. one day before Pesach, the air conditioning system went out in our house, and it was really busted. And the repairman said it was going to cost like $3,000 to replace it. So I go to shul the next morning, and not this shul, it was when I lived in another neighborhood, and the rabbi says to me, "So how's it going, Hillel?" I said, "Oh, Rabbi, it's going terrible." I tell him the air conditioner busted, and I have to spend $3,000 for a new air conditioner. And the rabbi said to me, "Mazel tov." Okay, so I went home, I had breakfast. My wife asked me, she asked, "Who was at shul?" The usual. What did they say? Nothing. It's always the same. But she says, so I told her that, I told the rabbi about the air conditioning, and he wished me a mazel tov. And she said, "Why did he wish you a mazel tov?" I says, "I don't know." She says, "Why didn't you ask him?" I says, I'm afraid of the rabbi. I'm not going to ask him. So she says, "Go back and talk to the rabbi." So I went back, talked to the rabbi, and I said, "Rabbi, you remember this morning? Why did you wish me mazel tov that my air conditioner broke?" And he said, "Oh, it's very simple, Hillel. We have a basic idea in the Talmud, it's in Maseches Rosh Hashanah, that your income is decided by Rosh Hashanah. That whatever money you're going to make the rest of the year, it's decided that day. Obviously, what happened is you made too much money, and therefore some of it has to be taken away." That in itself was hard to believe, but I said, "Okay, but then if that's the case, why a mazel tov?" And then he said to me, very wise, Rabbi Benzinger, he said, because we have a tradition in the Kabbalah that the fastest way to get rid of that kind of excess income is through medical bills. So mazel tov, you got to get rid of your excess income by getting a new air conditioner and not through paying medical bills. So it helps a little bit, when things like that happen. Okay, the renewal. So there was a certain Rabbi Yaakov Beirav in Tzfat, in Safed, who said, he relied on a rather obscure reading of Maimonides to say, you know what? If we have the world's greatest rabbis concentrated in the land of Israel, and all these great rabbis agree with one another, which is a very difficult thing to achieve, and they appoint one of their membership as a real rabbi with smicha, then smicha restarts. In other words, he wanted to resurrect the smicha that had the power of the Sanhedrin 1,500 years earlier. And sure enough, in Tzfat, you had this unusual circle of individuals, and it truly was an exceptional group of people. The Arizal, who founded really, much more even than the Baal Shem Tov, founded the entire Hasidic movement only a couple of hundred years later. The Ramak, author of the Tomer Dvorah, a phenomenal work of soaring genius, and Rabbi Yosef Karo, who was not the least of them. And so Rabbi Yaakov Beirav said, "This is it. We have the Kehillah here. Let's do it." And they pitched in, they all agreed, and they appointed Rabbi Beirav as the first rabbi with smicha in modern times. Yes, Jack?
Where did the concept of rabbi originate?
Chief rabbi?
Yeah, we have chief rabbis. Where did it go back in history, or
Who appointed? It's a good question. I'm pretty sure, off the top of my head, it comes from the French Revolution, because when Napoleon, ironically, he also reestablished the Sanhedrin, and we'll talk about it in a couple of weeks, actually, but he reestablished a kind of Sanhedrin, and he wanted to organize the Jewish people in France along the same system of organization as the consistoire, the consistory of the French Catholics, with a hierarchy of deacons and priests and so on, all the way up to an archbishop. So he set the same setting for the Jews, giving them their own organization with a chief rabbi, state-appointed chief rabbi. And I may be wrong, but I believe that system was emulated in England and in Germany and even in Israel as a structure. Of course, when you have countries like Israel, no one pays attention anyways, and everybody has their own chief rabbis. But whenever you involve money, and the idea of, like, if you want to be a rabbi in this country, you have to be licensed, and you have to be associated with the official synagogue, then it makes a big difference. So I'm pretty sure that's where it is. I don't think you have chief rabbis in the Arab world at all. No, I'm seriously. I mean, Jews in the Arab world. Okay, sorry, Stephen, did you have a question? Oh, Judith.
It's Italy, Greek. It's the
Mediterranean basin.
Mediterranean and is all about money, because there's subsidies for the schools and such other things. And so, yes, they have initiated this. I know it's post-World War II.
Yeah. Well, I think France is pre-World War II. That really is 1804. But I think that system was emulated through much of Europe. Okay, excellent question. Okay, so what happens is, now, Rabbi Beirav also, once he is ordained, you know, the first real rabbi with real smicha, he, of course, ordains all the people who ordained him. So you have about 5 or 6 rabbis with real smicha, who are now ordaining their students. Now, Rabbi Yosef Karo himself, of course, was ordained, and he passed it along to several of his students, but there are several passing literary references that indicate that, you know, maybe he didn't take it so terribly seriously himself. He went along with it, but you don't see a great deal of enthusiasm for it on Rabbi Karo's part. Nevertheless, this relates directly to the Shulchan Aruch, which I'll get to as soon as I answer Ms. Abramson's brilliant question.
Okay, so they wanted to start the Sanhedrin in Sfat, right?
Well, start smicha, not necessarily the Sanhedrin. You have to get 71 rabbis to who are similarly ordained to get the Sanhedrin.
Okay, but Sfat is this tiny area in Israel, and okay, they had a lot of authority, but what about all the other great rabbis in other places? They just, agreed with this whole smicha thing?
Oh, excellent question. Do you think the other great rabbis agree? No, absolutely not. And they did not. And what made it especially painful is that one of the chief critics of Rabbi Yaakov Beirav ordained him, and still he rebelled against it. I can't remember his name. I can't remember whether I put it here. No, I did not. But yeah, it was not at all universally accepted, and basically it kind of fell flat after about 2 generations. I don't think there's anyone today who can actually claim to have received smicha back from Rabbi Yaakov Beirav. It lasted about 100 years or so, and then it just faded away. They could not get enough traction in the outside world. It's true you had a tremendous concentration of genius in this one little tiny town in northern Israel, and what they said had huge shock waves. It sent huge shock waves throughout the Jewish world, but not enough to really last past their own personalities. Let us turn now to the actual work for which most people know Rabbi Yosef Karo, the Shulchan Aruch. Now, the Shulchan, at this time, when he's getting to the Shulchan Aruch, his main work really is the Beit Yosef, the commentary on the Torah, and to a certain degree, the Kesef Mishnah, his commentary on Maimonides. And, you know, everyone knows that there is one person on the planet who knows the halacha inside out from all the various perspectives, and he said, okay, now it's time for me to just list my conclusions. Again, the way the Beit Yosef works is it's a back and forth. It's a, you know why the Torah says this? It's because of this position in this Gemara and this passage over in this Gemara, and there's lots of analysis. In the Shulchan Aruch, it's just the bottom line. It's just this kind of chicken is not kosher, this kind of chicken is kosher. And that makes it much, much smaller as a work and much more manageable. But as I mentioned, he used the same structure as the Torah, so it really was found widespread adoption. One small detail, however, troubled particularly the Jews of Europe, and that was the Shulchan Aruch. When he felt uncertain about a position, he took it to his Beit Din. And what I mean by his Beit Din, or what scholars mean by his Beit Din, is 3 key opinions: the Rif, Rabbi Yosef Alfasi of North Africa, the Rosh of Provence, and the Rambam, of course, of Spain and Egypt. And between those 3 opinions, whichever way it went, 2 positions to 1, that's the position he would take. Since 2 of those rabbis were Sephardic, and of course Rabbi Yosef Karo is also a Sephardi, the Shulchan Aruch definitely tilts Sephardic. Whenever there's a difference between Ashkenazic and Sephardic practice, it definitely tilts towards Sephardic practice. And one of the major sets of opinions that he basically ignored were the Tosafists of Europe at that time. Those are the Ashkenazi scholars, 12th through the 15th century, and they hardly feature in his work. So many Ashkenazim felt resentful and felt that they were disenfranchised by this great work of scholarship. They were, however, mollified with the work of this man, Rabbi Moshe Isserles. This, unlike many of the other portraits, is probably more of an actual likeness. Rabbi Moshe Isserles, a 16th century rabbi, he was a youngster when Rabbi Yosef Karo was a senior scholar, he was so amazed by the Shulchan Aruch and by the erudition of its author, he decided that he would write a long encomium to that work, a long tribute to it, by appending Ashkenazic custom. And so, whereas the Shulchan Aruch is known as the set table, the Mappa, his commentary, is called the tablecloth, as it were, covering the Shulchan Aruch. And it serves several functions. Basically, it Ashkenazifies, it makes more Ashkenazic the Shulchan Aruch by describing dissenting opinion of European custom. But from time to time, he disagrees with the Shulchan Aruch openly as well, just on logical grounds or on source text, not necessarily on customary areas. One of the brilliant aspects of his work, however, and I have yet to discover whether this was his intent or whether it was the publisher's intent, but the way they presented it was genius. Instead of producing two separate books, or let's say the Shulchan Aruch in the center and then the Mappa around it, they actually interleaved the text so that they used two different fonts, and you read the same work, the Shulchan Aruch printed in traditional Assyrian block print, and the Ramah written in Rashi-style cursive, right there in the same sentence. And it feels like two people having a conversation. When you read them together, the Shulchan Aruch will begin a sentence, the Mappa will add a few comments, and then the sentence will pick up again by the Shulchan Aruch, and it feels like a unitary whole that brings together Ashkenazic and Sephardic custom. Together with the Mappa, the Shulchan Aruch became universally accepted, and the dissent virtually disappeared. And that's why it has become, to this day, the most widely accepted code in Jewish history. The legacy of the Shulchan... Oh, I forgot to mention one really important thing. In terms of the smicha, before I go on, one of the criticisms of the Shulchan Aruch at the time was that perhaps he wrote this relatively easy code because this was a way of, disseminating the authority of the rabbis of Tzfat. That this was the way of describing that this is the ultimate code for the Jewish people forever. It didn't work out that way, but it was a kind of democratization of Judaism, specifically in his position. Now, one last thing that's very important to mention that ties this all together. The Shulchan Aruch, the Yosef Karo, was also a profound Kabbalist. He wrote very little works of a Kabbalistic nature themselves, but quite often he introduces the Zohar as a source text in his writings, indicating that the Zohar for him, of course the central Kabbalistic work that was discovered in the 13th century, indicating that this has a phenomenal import to his thinking. And in fact, as he confided to his students and possibly even wrote an autobiography, there's some controversy over the actual authorship of it, he claimed not to have figured out the halacha, not to have deduced it from the text, but rather he was visited nightly by a spiritual being called a Magid, who would relate to him everything that he was supposed to write the next morning. And there's a lot of debate over whether or not this was actually his position or it was ascribed to him by others, but there's no doubt that he was deeply influenced by Kabbalistic thinking. And his work, although we tend to think of halacha as being fairly dry, straightforward, legalistic, I mean it is law, hence legalistic, but in reality it is infused throughout with the deeper sentiments of the mystical tradition. He brought these things together in a most amazing way, and particularly when you add the work of the Ramah, making it more of an Ashkenazic style work, the Shulchan Aruch leaves its legacy on all Jewish practice to the present day. He died at age 87 and was buried in Tzfat, and one of the eulogies spoken over him at that point referred to the pasuk in Song of Songs 5:11, Rosho Kesem Paz, his head is of fine gold, and the word for gold is paz, spelled 87 in Hebrew gematria, the age at which he died, and left a phenomenal legacy to the Jewish people as a whole. I want to thank you very much for your attention and your indulgence. If you're on the mailing list, thank you very much. If you're on the mailing list, when I've got this loaded to the web properly, maybe Steve will help you with that, then you'll be able to review this and critique it with your friends. Have an excellent evening.